Hey guys, and welcome to the Performance Hub podcast, and thanks for tuning in. So before we get started, we want to let you guys know about an amazing offer we have going at the moment. Using the coupon code COMMUNITY, we have 1 month free access to the Performance Hub. So this is our online members site where we have tons of content from in-depth exercise tutorials, videos on different strength and conditioning methods, program templates, articles on nutrition, stress management, and just a ton more content. So head over to www.pikeperformance.uk to sign up and get started on that today. As well as that, below this video, we've linked all our social media channels, as well as all of our guest socials. So go and like and comment and share, as it really helps us to be able to produce more content for you guys, like the interview that we had today. Okay, so that's enough of that. Let's dive into today's interview and see what it's all about. Hey guys, and welcome to the Performance Hub podcast. So today we've got with us a jiu-jitsu and MMA strength and conditioning coach, Andrew Hardwick. He's a great guy, and he's got some great insights into how to train combat sports athletes. And if you are a combat sports athlete, I think you're going to get a lot out of today. We're going to talk about planning your kind of competitive year and how to think about that longer term athletic development when you're structuring your training. We're going to talk about how to maintain your conditioning and your strength during this lockdown period, and a host of other subjects to do with training combat sports athletes to get them fit and strong and ready for the demands of the sport. So dig into this. I think you're going to really enjoy it if you're into your combat sports, and have a listen. All right, welcome guys. So we've got Andrew Hardwick with us today. I've already done a little intro, but why don't you tell us a little bit about where you've come from and a bit about your training history and kind of how you've ended up being an S&C coach?
God, it's an open-ended question. But yeah, so I mean, my sort of, I mean, I've been involved in sort of competitive sports since I was probably about 4 years old.
Oh wow, okay.
I've done pretty much everything that you sort of do when you're a kid, like played football, did all that sort of stuff. End up sort of settling down into rugby. So I played rugby league for most of my life. I played to like a pretty decent standard of rugby league, but I got quite a severe knee injury when I was about 15 years old.
Right.
16 years old. So that in for those who don't know the sort of scouting process, sort of 15, 16, if you're going to play professionally, it's probably about that age you're going to get picked up.
Right.
I mean, I probably, looking back now, I probably wasn't good enough to play professionally. I mean, I'm like 5'8" and like 8 kilos. I'm not really built to be professional.
Yeah, time to get bigger.
Yeah. But that's the age you sort of you're going to realize whether you're probably going to play professionally or not at that age.
Sure.
I mean, that's a sad thing, but it's part of the game, I guess. So obviously I missed all that with a knee injury. So it sort of redirected my focus. I mean, I'd been lifting things for a little bit, just for mainly because I was like 15 and wanted to have a six pack really. But so my sort of attention shifted a little bit, and I started thinking, right, I've got this. I can't play rugby, so what can I do? How can I sort of progress it? And I've only ever been good at sport. That's all I've ever been good at. I'm not very good at much else. So I did the sort of usual thing. I got my undergrad degree, farted about at university for 3 years, and then sort of came out, got just a menial job. I just needed money quickly, so I just got a job working in a factory, essentially for a lighting company. And throughout this time, I was obviously still very interested in sort of lifting and sport, but I knew I didn't want to go back playing rugby. And I just happened to stumble across the jiu-jitsu academy in the town that I'm in. A friend of mine shared a post, and obviously I'd followed the UFC for a couple of years and was sort of searching around. I'd boxed for a little bit. I'd been boxing for about 2 years, but I didn't really like it. At sort of the age I was a bit sick of getting punched in the head. So I sort of sat that off, and I thought, and I'd wrestled quite a bit through rugby, quite fortunately. So I was like, you know what, I'll go and give this a go. This looks like I could translate my skills semi decently into this. even though I knew nothing about the sport and how you sort of do it, it looked like a grapple. So I was like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
I'll be all right at this. So I went and did that and never looked back. And sort of, I then just started to translate what I'd been doing previously from an undergrad degree to the bits of personal training that I'd done. Is then, right, well, how can I sort of enhance my career further in terms of how I can help individuals get better through that? Because again, comes to the realization quite quickly that I was never going to be a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu world champion.
There's still time.
Oh yeah, well, yeah,
There's plenty of masters categories.
Quite a pessimistic view on the subject, but I like to consider myself a realist. So I thought,
okay,
I'm probably never. Obviously I still compete quite a lot, so it's not that I can't be competitive, but the sort of underlying theme of, well, I'm probably never going to be a world champion. Was like, right, well, how can I take what I know and what I enjoy and what I love doing and help somebody who might have a better opportunity than I can in order to get there? And I guess that's fundamentally where a lot of coaches sort of find their passion, is that they want to help somebody achieve something that they might not be able to. A lot of them probably would be able to do it on their own, but try and guide them in a bit more of a efficient route, essentially, and help them not make the mistakes that a lot of us have made.
Sure, yeah. And so, was your undergrad in sports science?
Yeah, sport and exercise science, standard, really, the usual. Sport, really.
Where do you train? Where do you train jiu-jitsu? What's the academy?
So I train. I've got 2 gyms, quite fortunately. So I started off at the Alicat Academy. So that's a gym in Chorley. It's run by a guy called Neil Atkins. So that's where my not traditional jiu-jitsu, but the standard Brazilian jiu-jitsu pathway started. I started off very gi focused, very IBJJF focused, because that was all that was around at the time, really. So did that, and then when I got to the end of blue belt, the sort of sub-only scene exploded, and I was like, well, I fancy a bit of go of that. So I started training, obviously, a lot more no gi, submission grappling, and then I started going to a gym called ASW. Which is Abberton Submission Wrestling, which is the head coach is a guy called Darren Morris. And like, I mean, everybody says this, but in my opinion, I've been quite fortunate to train with some really, really good grapplers. But anyone who knows anything about Darren he's I'd argue the best grappler in the UK, like hands down. Like, he's like 50 years old and he's like 120 kilos and just like an absolute savage. He's been like national level judo, catch wrestling, like he's been around since the dawn of time. So his knowledge and sort of tutelage, just my submission grappling game just went like skyrocketed from there. So I'm predominantly at Alicat and Chorley, but at least twice a week when I can get down and see Darren. And there's Cam Atakaru, who runs the Manchester affiliation of ASW as well. So I go and see Cam quite a lot.
That's good to have a kind of a bit of diversity in terms of the people that are coaching you, you know? So
definitely.
Pick from different people's kind of, approaches and brains and things.
Yeah, definitely. So like Neil's come from like I mean, he's done sub only, but Neil's like very traditionally come from like a gi IBJJF background.
Sure.
Again, because that was all that was available really when he started. But like Darren and Cam are very much from the sort of MMA submission sort of only rule set world. So I get a nice balance between the two, really.
I think it's great to have that balance between the two, because it almost diversifies your sport into kind of 2 sports in a way. And I know for myself in my training, I have very different games in the gi and in no gi. No gi mainly geared towards a kind of sub-only approach. So it's quite nice to be able to kind of split your focus between the two kind of disciplines, if you like.
Yeah, I tend to have like 6-month shifts. So if I've got like a couple of sub-only fights lined up, so I'll just predominantly train no gi. I might do 1 gi session a week.
Sure.
But I typically find as I'm doing that, my gi sort of anticipation is building up. So any techniques that I've seen and things like that, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to put the gi back on. And then I'll do like 6 months in the gi, and then I'm like, right, I'm bored of this now. I'll go back to no gi for a bit. So it's good. It gives you, like you said, it gives you a good balance between two, and it helps not stagnate too much, I find.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. How long? So how long have you been training in jiu-jitsu?
It'll be about 4.5 years now.
Okay, yeah, great.
Roughly. Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's good
Goes
stuff.
quick, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It certainly does. So, so in terms of like you've been training for 4.5 years, you said you were lifting a little bit before you started training. So you started going into jiu-jitsu and starting to think about that when you're entering into the weight room. What sort of, were you training in what you would, or when you look back, were you doing the right things in the weight room, or were there mistakes that you were making? What was your approach like?
Oh, it was shocking. Like it's night and day from then, really. I mean, when I first started, obviously, I knew very little about the sport. So I was just going off things that I'd done in the past or things that I thought I knew at the time. I mean, I did when I was after my first year of training, I got my blue belt and did British Nationals. And I just basically spent like 8 weeks just doing circuits 3 times a week.
Right.
and I was when I got looking back now, obviously it's quite funny when I look back now, but I was so like I remember having like actual breakdowns at home. I was like dieting and I was that tired that I just thought, obviously I thought, oh, this is what fighters do. I'd seen Brock Lesnar doing it. Yeah, this is the grind.
Yeah.
So looking back now, it's absolutely night and day from what I was doing then. But yeah, it's strange how much you can develop in quite considerably. I mean, obviously, some people like 3-4 years seems like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small period of time. So it's once you sort of start to get into the meats and bones of the sport and start to understand it a bit more, then your development obviously skyrockets a lot more from there.
Definitely. So it's interesting, about that. It's that. I think historically, combat sports, MMA, probably predominantly, but boxing and jiu-jitsu and just combat sports, historically, I think had not been the best, or that there hadn't been the best culture in terms of S&C, and kind of approaching it in a very scientific way. Well, I mean, how would you say this kind of landscape is now in terms of S&C within combat sports?
I'd like to think it's getting better. I think the predominant problem we have is obviously MMA and jiu-jitsu are like in their infancy as sports. Like when was the first UFC? 1993. I think
early 90s, wasn't it? Yeah,
yeah.
92,
So
93.
if you say, all right, give it -5 years from there, realistically, we're still only looking at a sport that's 30 years old, for example. So if you look at that compared to, football, the performance side of football is, from what I've seen, is so in some cases shocking as well. They've got all the resources, all the money, all the facilities, and they're probably one of the oldest sports going, especially in this country. And they're sort of undervalued in terms of performance coaching. So MMA and combat sports in general, I think the problem we have is so obviously there are certain sports that have got, I mean, there's many arguments that you could obviously branch off from this department, but if you take like wrestling, for example, so wrestlers, if you're an elite level wrestler in this country, chances are you're on the GB squad.
Sure.
You'll have like elite performance pathways, and that'll sort of, you'll be on a step-by-step process towards the Commonwealth Games, the Olympic Games. So obviously they have, from the age of 10 years old, they have people that it might not be a full-time capacity, but they've got somebody saying, right, you need to go and lift weights, you need to go and do a run, this is how many times you need to practice your skill work, this is what you need to eat after your training session, for example. Whereas I think with jiu-jitsu and MMA, because obviously it's getting better, but because a lot of people have come into this, so you've got such an amalgamation of people if we take jiu-jitsu, amalgamation of people in jiu-jitsu, so you've got guys that used to be athletes, or you've got guys that are bankers that are 40 years old. Everybody's making assumptions based on what they've done for them, what has worked for them. And you've got a massive group of people who might not be athletic at all. They might have had no sporting experience in their lives. So for them to come into a sport and for them to sort of understand how these processes work and things that they should be doing, they haven't had that drilled in from an early age. So like I've got a physio, the guy who does all my physio work, Andy Hosgood, who runs a company called Summit. He's the head physio at quite a big MMA team.
Okay.
Up here in the north. And they've got like really, I won't say the name just in case no one wants me to say it, but they've got like multiple UFC fighters. And even he said the difference between those guys is you've got guys who were brought up in environments that didn't have this like elite performance platform, and then you've got guys that did, and the guys that did typically will just be like, all right, I'm just going to go and do my S&C. It's just something that you have to do that's part of your process.
Sure, yeah.
Or guys that have come through the non-tiered system approach, and they're just like, oh, do I have to lift weights? I thought I'd just go and hit some pads for a bit. So I think one of the problems we have as coaches, I mean, I've gone off on a massive tangent here. But,
no, it's good. It's an interesting viewpoint.
I think one of the jobs we have as coaches, as much as we are there to facilitate like performance increases, we want them to get stronger, fitter, faster, whatever. I think our jobs as coaches is to be educators as well. And this is something that I try and take great passion in, and I know you do a really good job of it as well, is trying to educate everybody in terms of this is how we can do things. This is how we can make a difference through this various different thing, whether it be, all right, we're just going to look at periodizing your training a little bit through a week, or planning your training, for anyone who doesn't know what periodization means. We're going to take a bit more of a structured plan. We might do a bit more on this day and a bit less on this day. Might be something as simple as that. It might be, we're just going to give you some carbohydrates after training. Do you know what I mean? Something as basic level as that could make a massive difference in terms of recovery levels and things like that. But it's trying to get that information out there. And I think that information, because people aren't going to read, no one gives a shit about scientific literature. Like Barry, who trains twice a week, who's got 3 kids and just goes for a bit of a break, he doesn't give a shit. Like, so it's our job to sort of take that information and then be like, look, this is the information. This is what it means in layman's terms. And this is what it's going to mean when you apply it to yourself. And this is how it could affect you. So I think, like I said, I think as the sport grows, and obviously like the UFC Performance Institute and companies like that are making massive inroads in terms of the scientific side of performance training for combat sports. And we're starting to really understand the sort of demands of the sports and how we can apply that. But fundamentally, it's not the everyday individual's job to understand that. It's our job to take that information and not just apply it to the athletes, but put it into the community so that wider groups of people can get this, because the more people that benefit from it, the faster the sport grows and the better the level of the sport gets.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. It's, you know, MMA and combat sports aren't alone. It is surprising, really surprising, how football sometimes can lag behind. I think it certainly seems to be getting better, and I wonder whether there's, because of the non-contact nature of the sport, there wasn't the value in S&C wasn't maybe there. Whereas when you look at rugby, obviously it's a very well developed S&C culture.
Yeah.
American football the same, and because of the contact nature, I think you're looking at well conditioned, you know, people with a good amount of muscle mass, being able to absorb a good amount of force and reproduce force is so vital in those sports.
100%.
You can probably see the value a lot easier than in football. You know, you might have a young guy who's just very talented in terms of his skill and be able to run rings around people, put him in the weight room, and there's just nothing there, you know.
Yeah, 100%.
But he's still a good player, you know.
Yeah, 100%. And this is where, I mean, there's obviously massive scope for this discussion, because this is where skill versus like physical attributes comes in, isn't it? Because especially for jiu-jitsu, because obviously we're in this world of like, skill beats everything. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that, all right, skill is obviously a massive factor. The most predominant factor that I doubt anyone's going to ever question the fact that is the underlying thing. You can't get somebody to back squat an extra 30 kilos and then suddenly they're a world champion. Do you know what I mean? No. Like it's not going to happen. So the skill has to be there, but it's having that underlying base physical qualities that are going to enable you to train longer, harder, without getting hurt as much, without needing to recover as much, and just having that underlying physical robustness that you can manage that training, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And you and I both know that there are probably guys in your gym who have a better technical knowledge and maybe even better application than you, but you can probably get the edge on them every time because you're stronger than them.
100%.
And then the other way as well, there are probably guys who are probably better, but if you can just outlast them and withstand the attacks because your fitness is better, you can beat them as well. So I think, we're definitely, the culture's definitely getting more realistic in terms of that, like, jiu-jitsu's for the little guy to beat the big guy. Yes, to a degree, but like when you get that absolute beast who comes in, who's never taken a class, and you're having real problem with him, and you're a blue belt or a purple belt or whatever, and you're like, oh, hang about, this guy, he's going to be a handful when he gets a little bit of, knowledge.
Oh, mate, yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, we had a guy, he doesn't train with us anymore because he joined the army, but we had a guy called Jake Sloan at our gym, and Jake, he was literally just one of the, like, probably if he'd have stuck with jiu-jitsu, probably actually had the potential to like compete at the highest level. Like the guy was just like, he barely lifted weights, things like that, and he had like a grip that was just like unbreakable. And he was just, I remember he got his purple belt before he left the army, and before he shipped out, he'd spent a month in Thailand.
Wow.
And he come back from Thailand, and he stepped off the plane, went to a competition, and just beat everybody. Like, he was just a freak of nature. Like, I think in his competition history, he'd lost one match. Wow. And he'd done like all the major IBJJF tournaments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you're always going to get a guy that's a freak of nature. Do you know what I mean? Like, everybody always likes to use Marcelo didn't lift weights, so I'm not going to lift weights. And it's like, you're not Marcelo Garcia. Like, nobody's Marcelo Garcia. There are always going to be outliers. And I guess that's the problem with jiu-jitsu, because we're always looking up to the next level in terms of, I want to be like this guy, I want to play this guy's game. But you're never actually going to get to that point with, most of us are never actually going to be that good. If that makes sense. Like saying, if I kick a ball against the wall, I'm going to be Cristiano Ronaldo. Like, there are certain attributes that you just have to have naturally, but it's then taking those attributes and enhancing them even more that's just going to make you that unstoppable force to be reckoned with. And I mean, like, most guys now, like, if you look at the top 10 on the like top 10 at Worlds, these guys are about as close to being full-time professional athletes as you can get. They've got nutritionists, they've got strength conditioning coaches, they've got, like, obviously their skills coaches, their head coaches, somebody who oversees their camps. Like, Atos, it's basically an Olympic training center.
Yeah.
And I think obviously that's something that in this country we don't necessarily have the infrastructure in order to facilitate. But I think it's something that if guys legitimately want to look at being elite, then we need to start thinking, right, how can we apply that within your setting themselves? But then on the other hand, if you've got someone who doesn't want to compete, it's how can we just keep you training consistently for the longest period of time, and you can get the most out of this sport that you can do.
Definitely. So that actually leads quite nicely on to kind of one of the things I wanted to speak to you about. And I know you've been putting out a fair bit of content about kind of planning or longer term planning for S&C, taking into account kind of competitive schedules, but then also, I guess, maybe for that non-competitive, athlete, if you like, how would you look at both of those populations and organize their S&C and organize even their skill training, say for, a whole year?
Yeah. So, I mean, right, we start with competitors because obviously they're probably the easiest ones to actually manage, actually. So I like, because, again, another problem with jiu-jitsu is we don't have competitive seasons. So we have pretty much, and in this day and age, if you want to compete every weekend, it'd be quite difficult if you had the resources. So we don't have competitive seasons. So this leads to very quite open-ended gaps in the year. So you'll have like intense periods and open periods. What it also, I find, leads to is guys just having a mishmash of training. So they're sort of like, I've got a fight next week, so I'm going to do some sprints. And then the week after, they're like, I don't have to fight anymore. I'm going to go lift some weights. And then we just get this like up and down, and everything's like swirling around. Like no one really knows what's going on. So I like to break it down, and I like to get an individual to sort of have as best of a long-term plan as possible. Obviously, matches and things always come up. Sure. But if we're looking at a competitor, then obviously, like if we talk highest level, we've got a black belt who's competing at an elite level. So they know fundamentally, roughly, when each tournament's going to be. Like Worlds is in June, Pans is in April, like World No Gi's like October time, I think. So they have a rough idea. They know ADCCs every 2 years. Like they've got a general idea of when the tournaments are going to be. So what we can do from there is we can devise a plan. So we have like an in-season and an off-season almost, like you would in rugby or football, or you can MMA, you can call it in-camp and out-of-camp periods. So what I like to do is we have a competition period and then we have a non-competition period. So competition periods will typically be like 2 to 3 months in length, and then the off-competition periods will be pretty similar. This is obviously you'll know, but like for anyone who's listening, this is like what we call like block periods essentially. So you're breaking everything down into block cycles essentially. So you know roughly the physical qualities that you want to try and build upon and work upon in that period. It just makes it a bit easier when everything's all over the place and you don't have much structure to structure it essentially.
Sure.
So we'll have block periods. So a competition period, and then from there, what we will do is we will rank the competitions based on priority. So you'll have essentially so we'll have a 3-2-1. So a first rank competition, this will be like the highest priority to you. So it might be something that's got a lot of nostalgia behind it. It might be something that has some value in terms of like sponsorships. Obviously, if you win bigger competitions, you might have a chance to win sponsorships. In terms of like recognition and all that sort of stuff. You might be against a good opponent that you've lost to in the past, whatever that may be. So this is what we'd rank as a high priority. Priority 2 would be something that still has that intrinsic value to you. Extrinsic value in terms of like sponsorship requirements, things like that. But it might not have as much intrinsic value, for example.
Yeah.
Then priority 3 is typically something that this might be for a more of a seasoned competitor. This might be like a local comp, for example. So you're not really that fussed about the outcome. Obviously, you want to win it, but it's not life or death whether you win it or not. So, in these periods, what we would do is we would try and sort of start the period with either 1 or 2 priority 3 competitions, because this is like warm-ups. This is like pre-season friendlies essentially. I want to emphasize that we don't care about the result. This is a chance to implement strategic parts and whatever you need to work on up from your off season. We can identify weaknesses, things like that we need to improve on. Then obviously in the middle we'll have 2 or 3 to 4 priority 1 or priority 2 competitions, and then we'll either finish with a priority 3 or we'll just call it from there.
Sure.
So obviously this gives us an amount of time that we can then say, right, this is where we need to be our prime. So we'd call this like a peak period. So like a 2 to 3 week window where essentially we want to be as fit, as strong as we possibly can. So obviously we'd implement various different training methods. So obviously you've got like, basic like strength conditioning models. So close to competition, you're a bit more specific in nature. Further away from competition, you're a bit more general in nature. For anyone, I've got a video out there. If anyone wants to see it, I think it's on Instagram. I did like a series on it on my Instagram TV. So if anyone wants a bit more detail, it's quite easy to find. But the basic idea is that it gives us chance to build on certain qualities that we want to work on. So obviously in this off-season period, obviously it gives fighters chance to relax a little bit, to recover from the intense burst of training or the competition schedule, because obviously it's quite fatiguing on your body, having quite a large amount of competitions at one time.
Yeah.
So it gives them a chance to recover it, gets them a chance to, if they're anything like me, I spend 6 months of the year just ignoring my misses. So like it gives me a chance to get back in the good books and sort of do that thing, socialize with your mates. But it gives us a chance to work on like base trainable qualities. So like basic strength levels, build some aerobic fitness, generally make sure that we're recovered from injuries or work on any rehab stuff or prehab stuff that we have to, and that sort of basic underline of training. And then as we progress close to the competition period, then we start to implement more power work, more interval-based conditioning work, speed stuff, that general sort of, obviously they're all topics within themselves. So obviously I'm generalizing quite a lot, but so these periods give us a bit more structure to the year, and I found that it generally helps competitors organise their heads a bit more. And like we talked about before, it can give you a chance, if you're mainly a no-gi competitor, it might give you a chance to put a gi on and get a bit of a fresh, fresh stimulus from that. I'm not saying it's the best method of doing it. I'm just saying I try to recommend it a bit more, because it just gives the guys that are competitors a bit more chance to recover and build upon them physical qualities that you might not get a chance to. If you're trying to get stronger, but you compete at the weekend, it takes you 2 days to recover, and then you don't train 2 days before the comp, you've only really got 2-3 days in the middle of the week that you're going to be like, right, I'm going to add a strength session in there. But realistically, are you actually going to get any stronger from that minimal amount of volume? So it gives us a chance to really like peel things back a bit, lower the intensity in terms of specific work, and increase the intensity of or volume of the sort of performance-based work. Now,
go on. Sorry.
No, carry on.
No, I was going to say, I think that's a really interesting kind of way of looking at jiu-jitsu related kind of S&C, because it's very different to MMA, really. Like it's much more of a kind of football/rugby approach, if you like, but maybe broken down into smaller seasons. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And like you say, it almost takes the pressure off in terms of a lot of the competitions that you're doing, because you're using them as a kind of an assessment process, really, I suppose. Looking at, right, let's do this competition and see what we actually need to work on. And I suppose you could apply that same methodology to your skill, your performance in the competition from like a tactical perspective, as well as your performance from like a physical perspective, to kind of hone your game plan,
100%. Like I mean, one of the problems we have in jiu-jitsu, again, another problem, is the scope of competition is massive. So you could have like one guy who say like, oh, this week I'm going to do a gi tournament, so I might fight 4 fights, 5 minutes in length, and then next week I'm doing a 10-minute sub-only fight. So you've got 2 massive physiological questions to ask there, because you've got different endurance demands, you've got different like conditions, like cardiac demands, like strategic demands, all these various different things. I mean, and then you could go even deeper and sort of in the sort of structure that I try and use is, we could go even deeper and say, right, in this competition period, you're only going to do matches that are of this length under this rule set. If you really wanted to peel back the sort of layers and go as deep as you possibly could, and make sure that you're only sort of peaking for a certain specific outcome. I mean, I don't go that deep into it because Jesus.
Well, the thing is, I suppose if your level 1 most important competition is a kind of main card appearance on Polaris. That's an important fight. It's worldwide. Attention. You're going to be, your name's out there, and you're having a 15-minute, sub-only match. If you're preparing for that by doing 6-minute IBJJF competitions, you're preparing a completely different tactical approach.
100%. And to be honest, like I said, I mean, you'll know, like getting jiu-jitsu guys to do anything's a nightmare. They just love training really hard. So it's
too fun.
Yeah, it's too fun. So you're always fighting an uphill battle. But so you could, if you wanted to break that down even further and really sort of look at it in terms of an actual peaking for a certain specific time. Like if you look at like triathletes, for example, they'll do like multiple sort of race-paced practices before they actually get to the race. They peak for that point, don't they? So you could argue that, all right, doing a gi tournament or training in doing 5-minute rounds in the gi probably isn't the most efficient way of getting better for a sub-only fight. And I think as we start to see the branches out of different competitions, and we see the level within those competitions branch out, then we'll start to see guys preparing in different ways, I think. And I think it will take time, because obviously it's like we said, the sport's in its infancy, and developing over time. But I think as we do see this branch off, the same way that sort of jiu-jitsu and MMA has branched off quite significantly. Like you used to get guys that were like, oh, I'm a brown belt in jiu-jitsu. I'll just put my gloves on, I'll get in the cage, and I'll probably be able to grapple until I win. But we're starting to see that branch a bit more now because sport jiu-jitsu and MMA are becoming so different in entity. You almost can't really consider them in the same bracket really anymore.
Not really. They don't really translate very well.
No, so
there's not many people making sport jiu-jitsu approach work in MMA. Not many.
So I think we'll see that branch out with sport jiu-jitsu as well. I think that you'll get like, I mean, you could talk about like Gordon Ryan and things like that. You've got like no gi specialists and gi specialists, but what happens if we get sub-only specialists and point specialists? And I guess we do have that in a way, but like you said, how we prepare for those matches is actually a very different process, both physiologically and tactically. So you could break down those sort of structures even more. But I
mean, how much do you kind of obviously do you communicate with the skills coaches that you kind of the people that you work with, talking about how they're structuring the kind of practices and the sparring rounds and things like this?
Yeah, so I don't have, I mean, so obviously the problem we have, again, another problem in jiu-jitsu, is, so MMA is a bit different, because obviously when they're in a camp, their head coach is overseeing that individual camp. So you can communicate if their head coach is open to it, obviously. You can communicate quite efficiently through them. In jiu-jitsu, the problem we have is we're all set on a structure, aren't we? We don't really have pro training and non-pro training. Like even if you have an advanced class, it doesn't mean that you don't have hobbyists in that class.
Yeah, of course.
So for me as a strength and conditioning coach, to ring up a skills coach and be like, "Hey mate, you've got this guy. I know you've got 40 other people in your class, but I want you to put all your attention and focus on what X person is doing." So you can't really do that because obviously the job of the head coach in a jiu-jitsu class is to oversee the development of everybody in that class. So I like to put a lot of accountability on the athletes I work with. I sort of say to them like, look, it's on your head in order to take a bit of accountability for your training.
Sure.
I will sort of, I'll give you the structure. I'll give you the strategy we need to implement. But fundamentally, it's on you to do it, really. Like, this is your development. You've got to be a bit more accountable in terms of how you're handling your training. So in terms of, like, obviously, I have no control over technique. That is their game. I don't touch that. Most jiu-jitsu competitors are fully aware in terms of how to handle technique and skill development. And then, again, that's the job of the head coach. Their head coach should be overseeing the technical development. From my point of view, what we will typically do is we will run energy systems or different intensity days. So we will have like high days and low days. So when somebody comes to speak to me and they're like, I'm a competitor, I want to do this. So I'll say like, right, well, what's your normal class schedule timetable look like? What days do you train? What times do you train? And which the harder sessions? I want you to sort of rank the harder sessions as best as you can. So they'll be like, all right, comp class is on a Tuesday and a Thursday, for example. So we know as a competitor, a comp class is going to be massively important in their training week. So this is what we do, right? We'll say, all right, so we'll plan a week, Monday to Sunday, well, Monday to Friday, let's say they rest Saturday and Sunday. So on Tuesday and Thursday, these are full whack. Like you go in as full tilt as you can, regardless of who your training partner is, whether they're a white belt or black belt. This is, if you have to let them know, you have to let them know, but you let them know this is comp pace. You're going at full tilt. You're going to go as hard as you can, tap as many people as you can. You're going for it. And then what we'll do on the other days is this might become on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. These will be what we call like technical days. So when you've got like a 80 to 100% on your comp days, you might do 50 to 70% on your technical days. So you can still roll, but what we might say is if they've got like access to heart rate monitors, we might say, all right, I want you to try and keep it within this zone on this day.
That's tough.
Yeah, it is tough, but I'm more concerned about them attempting it than I am
100%.
like pulling it off. And it's a good little test for their ego as well to see if they can keep themselves under control when someone's putting the hammer down. But Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll use these like more technical days. So this is like a tactical day, I should say, not a technical day. This might be like, right, if you've got a new game plan or a new technique, this is the time to work it. This isn't, you're not using your A game. You don't have to worry about winning or losing or tapping. I want you to go in and we're going to work like, if you've not got heart rate on it, you could use an RPE scale. So you could be like, right, 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, absolute max effort level. And this is just going to enable us to work different energy systems, because obviously if it's a bit lower intensity, we're working that aerobic system. If it's a bit higher intensity, we get a bit more like lactate accumulation and things for those who are a bit more scientific. Obviously like glycolytic system, a bit more lactate accumulation, things like that. So we're working relevant training systems. We're getting the specific skill adaptation that we want to facilitate during those sessions. But by spacing it out, we're also giving the body a chance to recover and repair and sort of be fresh again for the higher intensity sessions that they're going to get probably the most out of.
Yeah, I think that's a really sensible system. There's definitely a kind of period of adaptation probably between blue belt and purple belt, I'd say, where you realize that you don't have to come in and try and put the hammer down every session and try and dominate everyone that you're rolling with. And I think that little realization can be so important in terms of getting or utilizing your skill sessions as some form of conditioning, or getting the most conditioned or the most conditioning that you can, or the best conditioning you can back from your sessions, rather than just going in and trying to beat everyone up, 100%.
100%. And I think there's what like I said, once people sort of get this realization that we can use a session of grappling much more than just a grappling session. Like we can get an aerobic, like an energy system adaptation. You can get like endurance adaptation. It's just about how you apply yourself within those sessions. And I think one of the important things that people forget to realize is the guys that are at the top of the game might not necessarily, they probably train the same amount, but what they will do is they'll go into each session with a purpose.
Sure, yeah.
So whether this might be a technical purpose, it might be like, I'm just going to go hell for leather for an hour, no rest. I'm just going to go. And it gives them, you realize that you can get more out of a session than just going in, drilling an armbar 10 times. I have a few rounds, shower, and I go home. And then I go in and repeat the process. And in a year's time, have I actually ever got better? Well, it depends on your sort of learning ability. But if we can apply a bit of purpose to each session, then we get obviously the physical responses that we want to see in terms of a competitor, but B, it gives them a bit of a mental break as well, because you'll know yourself, like sometimes you go to class and you're like, fucking hell, I just can't be arsed here. So like,
yeah, definitely.
If you know that you've got a day where you can back off a little bit and be like, right, I only have to train at like 50% intensity tonight, you still go to training, you're still going to get something out of it, but it doesn't have to be hell for leather. You're not going to get as banged up as much. You might not pick up any injuries. And don't get me wrong, you can't train like this all the time. There are times where you do have to put the hammer down and go hard, but there are times where we can back off as well and still get better.
I think the term "the gift of injury" would be relevant in this instance, because I know from myself picking up injuries and then still wanting to train because it's kind of an outlet and it's social time for me with the family and things like that at home. So I don't want to miss the training session, but I can't go in and train, and maybe sometimes I can't even spar, at all. But going in and trying to get a good training session, working around an injury, can be a really useful tool in terms of working out how to train at a much lower intensity and coming away from that session and being like, actually, I had a really good session and I executed all the things I wanted to do, because those things were maybe not getting submitted by a certain person, maybe, practicing your side control escapes, maybe setting up some grips for a specific thing. And that was my goal. Yes, if you scored every round, I probably lost every round. But in my head, actually, I won every round because I did the things that I wanted to do. And you stand up at the end and you feel like you could keep going for another hour because you haven't really been trying that hard. And you look around and everyone else is just fucked, and you think, that was a great session. You know,
Yeah.
but it kind of teaches you, even when you're back and you're not injured, how to write. This is a low intensity session. It's going to be 30-40%, right? These are the things that I'm going to do, you know, rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to try and beat everyone, but using 30 to 40%, that quickly escalates up to full scale rolling. You know, it's hard to stop it, isn't it?
100%. I think a lot of it goes back to sort of trying to keep that white belt mentality, and that everybody always talks about that. Oh, you never stop learning and things like that. But I think when you, like you said, you hit that point at like purple belt, where at white belt, you probably do these things in terms of, oh, when you go to, I remember speaking to somebody, a friend of mine, she just started training and she was like, I don't know how to approach sessions. I'm like, right, well, you're going to lose every round. So don't worry about losing every round. Try and just set yourself like micro goals within that sparring session that you can do. Like you said, it might be, I'm not going to get submitted. I'm going to work a sweep that I've done. And that's how you actually develop. And I think as your technical proficiency increases, and you get to like purple belt level, and everything becomes much easier because you've had a game that you've built upon, or you know a certain sweep that you can always get to. But if we actually broke things down a little bit and said, do you know what, I'm going to have a bit more of an objective mentality when it comes to my training, and I'm going to approach it like I would in that white belt class. Like I'm just going to hit one sweep, or I'm just going to work an escape, like you said. Then your actual possibility for development is much more enhanced than just going in and doing the same shit that you do every day.
Yeah, 100%. Just to go back to, just to kind of look at jiu-jitsu in terms of, you know, using skill sessions and trying to get the best kind of conditioning response from that session. I know, you know, obviously you work with MMA fighters and jiu-jitsu fighters. I don't know if you see a difference in terms of how people are coming to you in terms of their conditioning, their aerobic conditioning, their strength, and whether you see any differences in terms of the culture when you're looking at jiu-jitsu fighters and MMA fighters, and, you know, the differences that you see between those populations.
I mean, it obviously completely varies on the individual. MMA guys, I've found, typically tend to be a bit more. It's a tough one, really. MMA fighters, hang on, I'll go back again. Jiu-jitsu fighters typically maintain a decent level of training throughout a year because, like you said, it's fun, isn't it? Like, it's easy to do. Even when you're not training hard, these guys will still be training. Like a competitor who might be in an off season probably still trains 4 or 5 times a week. They've still got a massive training base underneath them. Whereas with MMA, I think guys typically take a bit more of an in camp and an out camp. So when they're in camp, they train really hard, and when they're out camp, they tend to let themselves go a little bit. Generally, obviously, I'm generalizing. Please don't take offense by that. So I think with jiu-jitsu, we tend to see, so we don't have to, like I said, when we use this in-season and off-season model, we don't necessarily have to do too much of certain things. Like most jiu-jitsu guys will have a decent aerobic capacity if they're training upwards of 5 sessions a week, because they're generally sparring quite hard. If you're doing 50 rounds a week, if you stick an heart rate monitor on somebody at training, and let's say they're a purple belt and above, you stick a heart rate monitor on them, chances are most of their sparring sessions will be quite aerobic in nature. So they're always going to get some level of aerobic stimulus. They might not be able to run 3 miles in like 15 minutes, but they still have a decent base level. I think for MMA guys, the temptation can be quite high to sort of fall off the wagon a little bit, if that makes sense, when they come out of camp or they finish a fight. I think it's getting better. I think guys are getting more professional. But again, we're still dealing very much with this, like I referred to in the past, previously, is that we've still got, if you come from boxing, then boxers are very much, or when I'm in camp, I'll train hard, but then when I'm out of camp, I probably won't do that much. I'll just generally work and spend time with my family. Again, I'm generalizing.
Yeah.
Out of context, but
it's calling people out.
Yeah, I know. I'm worried because I can't fight for shit, mate. So, but generally, that's what I think. Like I said, jiu-jitsu guys tend to be a bit more lacking on the strength side of things. I think most combat sports are. I think most people are a lot weaker than they think they are when you compare them to more established sports. So I think across the board, that is a big factor. Guys just generally aren't strong enough.
Are you worried about? Do you have norms or not norms? Do you have kind of specific levels that you're trying to get people to in terms of their kind of big hitters? So you worried about seeing those numbers like consistently going up, or do you just want to get people in the weight room, get some volume through them, and kind of start looking at like, you know, just conditioning their tissues, if you like, rather than, not that the two things are mutually exclusive, but where's your focus in terms of strength work?
Depends completely on individual. If we've got a 21-year-old who's like, oh, I want to be world champion one day, then my priority is like, well, we need to get these numbers to go up. You've got to get stronger, because when you get to that elite level, these guys are just you have to be strong. Like if you look at ADCC last year,
everyone's a beast, aren't they?
Everyone was an absolute monster. So you've got to be bigger, you've got to be stronger. So in that context, if we're looking at somebody who's like, right, the rest of my life is going to be jiu-jitsu, it's like, right, well, we need to see those numbers going up. You've got to get stronger. You've got to have, I think wrestling standards is like a 1.5 body weight bench, a 2 squat, or it might be a body weight bench. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I don't have prerequisites. I just have a sort of general ballpark figure in my mind that I if they're at a certain level and they've got a certain technical proficiency, then I'm quite happy with that, if that makes sense.
Sure,
because obviously we all know strength isn't just numbers on the board. There's a lot more that goes into it, but obviously the numbers make up a big part of that. So yeah, in that context, then my aim is like, right, we need to see performance increases, like quantitative performance increases, whether it be a resting heart rate for a cardiac response, or a wattage output in terms of a lactic work, whether it be total poundage, for example. Then if we're looking at a very, very serious competitor who's like, look, my life's going to be competing, then that's when we need performance markers, if that makes sense. 100%. If we've got, again, Barry, who's 40, who trains 2 or 3 times a week and enjoys spending the weekends with his kids, then that is a bit of a different. Obviously, we want to see him getting stronger. We want to see the numbers go up. But my primary focus is, are we seeing better movement economy? Are we seeing injury risk being reduced? What are we sort of assessing weaknesses and problem areas that may flag up something in the future? Are we managing his volume load? All these various different things that are going to factor a bit more around his sort of training health, should we say, rather than performance measures. Then that will play the factor. Obviously, there are certain things with the competitors that we still implement. But then we're looking at the difference between sort of a competitor and a non-competitor, then essentially, or a hobbyist.
Yeah, and you're gonna have a different approach, aren't you? It's like you say, there's a different end goal. Essentially, there's a different end goal, isn't there?
Yeah,
there are shared goals, but there's a different end goal. So we're gonna have
same process, different goal.
Yeah. And in terms of conditioning, you know, we spoke about using skill sessions for conditioning. Do you program? You know, I know that there are some pretty good coaches out there who don't really program a lot of conditioning because they let the skill work kind of do that. What's your kind of opinion on that? That definitely seems to be a little bit of a split, I would say, in the combat kind of S&C world.
Oh, you've opened up a can of worms here, mate, because this is all I've been thinking about for the past 3 weeks in isolation.
Okay, right.
So I mean, there's a lot of questions you can ask when it comes to conditioning. I mean, it started when I was in when we first went into isolation. I was like, right, I'm just going to go back and revisit old research, literature.
Right, yeah, nice.
And after about a full day of just sitting reading research, I was like having a mental breakdown. I was like, I can't.
Give it up. I'm quitting.
Yeah, I can't get my head around this. So I had to ring a friend, another coaching friend of mine, Chris Meyer, and had a bit of a breakdown with him.
Speaking to him tomorrow.
Yeah, Chris is class. So I messaged Chris and I was like, mate, I'm losing my head. I don't know what to do. And we had a chat and I eventually came back to my senses and was like, what? I wasn't worried about anything. But So conditioning is actually a really interesting thing to do. I primarily tend to focus on aerobic and lactic work.
Sure.
So obviously, if there's anyone who's not like scientifically inclined, aerobic systems like your base, that's like your long steady state, and then lactic's obviously your very, very short bursts, so sort of 6 to 10 seconds. My primary reasoning for this is because most guys could always do with better aerobic systems. I think we underutilize the aerobic system and train it more efficiently in terms of actual base level management. Like this time now, obviously we might talk about this in the future, but in terms of what people can be doing now, this is the perfect time to build aerobic capacity.
Certainly.
And then the reason I do lactic work over glycolytic work is because lactic work typically is shorter, it's sharper, it's a bit more time efficient. They get a good stimulus in terms of, I'm doing some sprints. And it's a bit easier to manage. It's a bit less fatiguing as well than sort of, you're not really going to see much technical fall off in 10 seconds than you are compared to like a minute of glycolytic work, for example.
Yeah, sure.
You've got less chance of sort of movement breakdown through fatigue. Another reason behind this is obviously a lot of gyms, and again, this is where it comes into a sort of asking the individual what their sort of training is like normally in the gym. Because if you take, like we talk about Atos again, if you watch videos of Atos, a lot of their training is like 1 to 3 minute goes. So it's very much in that lactic capacity zone, really. Like they're not really breaking that 3 minute mark. So it's very hard, very fast, sort of 1 to 3 minutes of action. So if you're looking at an Atos competitor, they don't really need much more glycolytic work because their skill training itself is essentially covering that base.
Sure, yeah.
So, and again, it always comes down to an individual needs analysis because we're talking about opponents, rule sets, individual age, gi, no gi, training history, all those various different things that coaches like to bang on about. But yeah, so my approach to conditioning for jiu-jitsu is a bit more like that. So I tend to favour more aerobic work and lactic work because most gyms, I think coaches would be quite naive if you were to assume that most gyms aren't doing these like 1 minute specific rounds, 3 minute specific rounds, alongside their full sort of competition round time. I think this is where me and Chris talk about this a lot. This is where this integration between strength or conditioning coaches and skills coaches needs to come in. Because if we say to one person, all right, we're going to do this, but then their skill coaches are like, well, no, we're focusing on this, then we're just mixing energy systems, really. We're not going to get the maximal adaptation that we need to get from that system. So
sure.
I think we're a long way off that yet. I don't think I think we'd need greater facilities in terms of like in-house coaches. Like you obviously might be a bit better for your guys because I think you train out the gym that everybody trains in, don't you? You work
yeah.
So obviously you're like you're basically an in-house strength conditioning coach. So you've got essentially, although you're probably not, obviously not too much detail, but you're probably not employed by the actual facility. You're still employed by yourself. But if we had guys that were like employed by facilities, then obviously we'd get that greater synergy between the skills and the additional supplementary training. But I think this is where the enhancements in combat sport conditioning are gonna lie. Sooner these gyms sort of recognise that if you have like in-house trainers, then that'll probably be much more of a greater asset to their athletes than it is to having external coaching sources.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate because there's something that I've wrestled with in terms of conditioning. And kind of organising your conditioning, if you like. And a lot of the time people will kind of tag on some, intervals after their strength training, and certainly that's something that I might do. But it's something that I've wrestled with, and the previous strength coach that I kind of worked or trained under he wasn't a big, fan of conditioning. And he said, if you're doing a lot of, max effort lifting, why are you tagging on alactic intervals at the end of that? Because you've essentially just done a whole session of alactic intervals, squatting, pressing, whatever. And definitely that got me thinking. I still wrestle with that at the moment in terms of, is there a need for alactic conditioning if we're doing a lot of weightlifting?
No, I agree, 100% agree. I think, I mean, you could look at this from 2 points of view. So whenever I include lactic work, it's typically very close to competition periods. So it might just be like a little extra kick up the arse just to get them through the door, essentially.
Yeah.
So you've got that to consider. You've also got the slight factor to consider that fighters generally are a bit nuts, right? So they like stimulus, I think, in terms of mental stimulus, in terms of I'm doing this is going to cause this. So if I said to a fighter, it might only be one session a week, what you're going to do, you're going to jump on an assault bike and we're just going to blow your lungs out for 10 minutes. They walk away from that session, and whether you could argue it's optimal in terms of actual energy system development, because like you said, if they've done a heavy weight session, then they've done an hour's worth of lactic work already. But if they can walk out, let's say they do one session on a Saturday, and they get to their comp and they're like, do you know what? I'm fit. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Because although we know that they're working their lactic system, it doesn't really feel like mentally for a lot of people, it won't feel like they're doing a lactic session. And even if we tell them that they are, if they don't give a shit, it doesn't register, does it? So sometimes it can, and it was actually another coach who sort of introduced this to me, because I was talking, I seen I don't know them personally, but I seen someone shared an image of their programming, and I was like scratching my head thinking, you know what, I'll fucking message him and I'll find out why they're doing this. And he sort of just said, look, we know it's not going to cause like a response in terms of it's not beneficial for performance, but if it creates buy-in for the athlete, then that can be a performance increaser in itself. If you've got an athlete who feels good and it feels mentally prepared, then surely that is more beneficial than always doing the most optimal thing, if that makes sense. As long as obviously we're taking into account recovery levels and we're not overstressing the body, both physically and mentally, then I think there's some basis for saying, all right, it's just a bit of a buy-in tool. It's going to give them that mental stimulus that guys require.
I think that's great. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things, aren't there, really? That it definitely in terms of buy-in, and like you say, people, they want to work hard. You know, MMA fighters are probably, and jiu-jitsu guys are probably more prone to this than even the general pop. But then the general pop, you know, finishing off with some sort of finisher, people go away and think, yeah, I've had a really good session. You take that finisher away and they might not, like you say, they might go away and be like, yeah, I feel like I could have, you know, done some more, if you like.
100%. Nobody remembers the first 5 minutes of the session, do they? They always remember the last 10.
Yeah, so, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a good one. And so, do you get your guys to, you know, jiu-jitsu guys, and MMA guys to run if they're going to be looking at their aerobic work? Do you get them to run, or? So
again, depending on prerequisites in terms of like injury history and things like that. I mean, normally no. In this current climate, yes, because we're a bit stuck with what we can do. Typically, aerobic work, I'll either use sort of like aerobic circuits, so 500-meter row, 5 minutes of skipping, that sort of stuff. Something that's low impact, a bit more extensive, and that sort of method. If they want to run, then obviously I'm not going to stop them running. I might just sort of say, look, this is the benefits of it. This is the negatives that might come from it. It's obviously your choice how you feel, because obviously a lot of people like running. It's quite a stimulating thing for them. So who am I to sort of, based on my biases, to say no, you're not running at all.
Sure. Yeah.
But as best as I can, I try and limit it because of obviously the impact complications and things like that. And I typically do favour the sort of more aerobic circuit-based stuff.
Yeah.
But again, it comes down to what sort of person they are. Like me personally, I can sit on a rower for an hour, but 10 minutes of running, and I'm like, nah, fuck this shit. I'm not doing this anymore. So like, it depends on their personality. If it's somebody who likes to run, like I said, who am I to tell them that they're not, that they shouldn't be doing it? If it's a treadmill, then arguably we're not pounding the ground as hard. I mean, minor details aren't going to make massive difference, but I typically favour more aerobic circuits, or rowing sort of ski ergs. I think are brilliant because they're very low impact and great on the lungs and the upper body. So we get a bit of a pulling stimulus as well.
Much easier to keep the heart rate a little bit lower as well, and not be
100%.
verging up into those kind of anaerobic heart rate.
And obviously we can track like heart rate levels are much easier on a rower and a ski erg rather than just like spending all your time running and looking at your watch. But yeah, so I tend to favour those sort of modalities. But in this current climate, obviously it's a great excuse for guys to get outside, get a bit of a sweat on. It's really easy. You don't need any equipment at all. So I've actually been recommending a bit of sort of low intensity running in the programming, obviously for the correct individual. But I've been using running recently. Running and cycling essentially, I think is great at in the current situation. Yeah, definitely.
Because I mean, as well, you know, like we spoke about, there is going to be aerobic kind of gains, if you like, from jiu-jitsu practice, from sparring. You know, you're going to get the aerobic system doesn't turn off because it's high intensity. There's still going to be those kind of gains, but like you say, the efficiency of what's happening there is you're maybe not going to be getting the kind of cardiac output benefits and things like that as efficiently as you would with that low intensity work. And then we need to look at the balance of the high intensity and low intensity work. So I think keeping that kind of aerobic work in, or dedicated aerobic work outside of training, has other benefits other than just developing their aerobic system. So I think it's definitely worthwhile.
100%. Like obviously you've got the sort of recovery side of things as well, in terms of tissue repair and things like that. So there is great application. Sort of there's application for it year round. I think at least a minimal amount of volume. Like you said, we do get a bit through training, quite a lot through training, I should say, not just a bit. But I think there's application for keeping in a certain level of aerobic work year round. Obviously, if when you break it down, if you wanted to look at it in more detail, then you've got obviously like resting heart rate levels. You can monitor those year round. But I think there's application year round. I think it's like anything, isn't it? It's how you apply it to the individual. Running 10 miles 4 times a week in a competition period probably isn't the most efficient.
Sure.
But it's how we can apply that aerobic work. And I think obviously again it comes down to lack of understanding. People hear aerobic or hear conditioning work and they think, well, I'm either running or I'm sprinting. It's one or the other. They don't sort of assume that we can make it more sport specific. You can like shadow wrestle, you can do hip escape, you can do sit throughs. It doesn't have to be on a treadmill for an hour.
Definitely.
But I'm a bit weird. Me, I actually prefer being in one place at one time and doing it for some reason. It's the only way I can mentally get my head around doing it. But
just to commit to it, kind of thing.
Yeah, just commit to it in that moment. Just get on whatever you need to get on and just go. But other people might favour a bit. I know Chris favours a bit more variety. He likes to do the aerobic circuits for his own training. So it's just individual dependent again. Like what their sort of training history is and what they like to do or don't like to do.
Great stuff. Right, let's finish off with a little 3 points. So I asked one of my previous guests the kind of 3 best things that he would advise someone to do for their kind of health and performance. And I guess let's ask the same question, but maybe more geared towards performance for kind of MMA and jiu-jitsu. What would be your 3 kind of most important factors for someone improving their performance and health, I guess, in jiu-jitsu and MMA?
Oh, that's a tough question. Sleep as much as possible. That's number 1.
Yeah, nice. Good.
Sleep as much as possible.
Do you take naps in the day?
Yeah, all the time. All the time. As much as you can. Anytime you get an opportunity to sleep, go to sleep. That's my perspective on it. Number 2 would probably get stronger in some capacity. So whether it be, obviously, again, the strength term is quite general, but the benefits of improving strength are like tenfold. Like look at movement efficiency, tendon and joint strength, actual force output, like all the various different factors that actually come from just getting stronger. Like you said, we get a conditioning element in terms of movement economy and lactic capacity. Getting stronger, I'd always recommend somebody gets as strong as they can that's not going to negatively impact their sport. So stay within your limits, but progress correctly through strength training. I think it's massive, and I think it's got such a wide application in combat sports. It's very general, but again, we could be here for another 3 hours if we were talking about the different applications of strength. But just get stronger in some capacity, whether it's swinging a kettlebell. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of kettlebells, but if it's all you've got, then crack on. Whether you got a barbell, dumbbells, machines, whatever it is, just there is. I think there's some application. You could make an argument for any type of strength training in terms of performance for jiu-jitsu. Like
Definitely.
you've got Dante Leon, he does like West Side. You've got Gordon, who's like 3 sets of 25 reps. You know what I mean? Like very, very high metabolite bodybuilder work. But I think there's application for everything. So I'd always say get stronger in some capacity. Number three. It's a tough one, this, you know. There's so many things you could say.
Yeah.
I genuinely, as it's the least scientific thing or science-based thing I'll ever say, but is always do something you can enjoy.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I think so many people try and force themselves to do things just because somebody says it's good, and obviously that's fucking hell. That's what our jobs are based on, is us lot telling people what to do because it's based on something somebody wrote because they measured something in a fucking study. But always do something you can enjoy. If you can stick to something that's going to have as much benefits in terms of mental health as well as it is physiologically. And obviously, we all know consistency is the underlying factor behind everything. So doing something you can fundamentally enjoy and stick to that's going to enhance your performance is the best I can.
Definitely.
I should probably actually from there, there's number 4. Number 4.
3.5.
Yeah, get a coach, hire a coach.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I've got one, like Crystal's mine. That's how I got to know Chris. Whether it be on a one-to-one capacity or just somebody to have a general chat to and run your ideas past. Most guys I speak to within the UK are extremely approachable, extremely friendly, and I guarantee if you send them a message, I mean, there's a couple of tossers out there, but most of them, if you drop a message of like, I'm a bit unsure what to do here, I'm sure they'll give you an honest answer as best as they can.
Yeah.
So at least speak to somebody, don't try and do it yourself, or if you do, just have somebody that you can just bounce ideas off, and just get a bit of assistance with it, because that's fundamentally what hundreds of people have spent thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds and thousands of hours learning about and applying in order to benefit people. So sort of a 3.5 is either hire a coach or at least have contact with somebody who can help you in some capacity.
Befriend one.
Yeah, befriend
one.
I
think you're definitely right. Reaching out to people is so important, and 99% of the time people are pretty good. And I know that if anyone asks me a question, I will answer their question, because
100%.
The worst thing you can do is kind of keep it all in and be like, no one's allowed any of my information unless they pay me. You know, that's, as a coach, I just found that's just not a productive way to operate your business, but also just not a productive way to be. So it's, I'll give out as much as possible. So if anyone's this and you've got questions, just message myself or Andrew, and I'm sure we'll be happy to help.
100%.
Yeah,
we've got nothing else to do, is it?
Yeah, exactly. At the moment, look, I'm just looking for things to do. Please message me. But look, thanks for coming on, and thanks for speaking to us. So there was loads of really interesting kind of insights into strength and conditioning for combat sports there, and I'm sure anyone in the combat sports world listening to this will be taking some pointers into their next kind of training session. Where can people kind of find you and get hold of you and read your work and things like that?
So obviously on Instagram, I am brotherhood_health_performance. Facebook is Brotherhood Health and Performance, and the website is www.brotherhoodhealthperformance.com. I mean, obviously you can find like my actual profiles, but they're not really that good. Like I'm not really much of a social butterfly outside of that. But yeah, so so they're the sort of usual means of contact. Yeah, you can find me through them.
Okay guys, thank you for listening, and thank you for Andrew coming on and giving us some amazing insights into strength and conditioning for combat sports, jiu-jitsu, MMA. You know, some really good stuff there on structuring not only your strength and conditioning work, you know, in the gym, but also your time on the mats, and you know how to kind of organize that to get the most out of your skill work. So some really good stuff, and definitely some great takeaways in terms of structuring your training over the space of a year and kind of looking at how you're going to organize that, and some really good stuff that we can take away and start implementing you know, straight away. So really happy to get Andrew on. We'll definitely have him back to look at some of those things that we touched on in more detail. Like I say, we've got links down below for our socials as well as Andrew's socials, so go and follow him. There's some great stuff that he puts up on Instagram, you know, to do with what we've been talking about. If you haven't already, go and sign up for the Performance Hub, our online members site. There's a fair bit of content on there that's kind of focused around combat sports and S&C and training for combat sports. So it'll be really useful if you are a combat sports athlete or an enthusiast. Go on there and check out that stuff, because it's something that's close to my heart. And otherwise, look guys, we're going to be back with some more amazing guests lined up, so really stay tuned for those guys, because there's going to be some amazing interviews being released soon, and we'll see you guys next time.